The sun sets here in the middle of November, and then it just doesn't come back. Not for about 2 months. There is no road out, no highway, no bridge, nothing that ties this town to the rest of Alaska by land. And a single gallon of milk at the store can run you close to $10. Everything about this place says it should be the poorest, most desperate corner of America. But it isn't. It is almost the exact opposite. This is Utqiagvik, Alaska. For most of the last century, the outside world knew it as Barrow, and we'll get to why the name changed, because that story matters more than it sounds. It sits at the very top of the United States, on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, farther north than any other town in the country. Around 5,000 people live here, most of them Iñupiat, whose families have hunted this coast for thousands of years. And here's the thing that makes no sense at first. They are not clinging on. They are not stuck. Most of them are here on purpose, and the town they live in is one of the best run, best funded small towns in the entire country. So how does that happen? How does a place with no road, 2 months of darkness, and $10 milk end up richer and steadier than towns you can drive to in the lower 48? The answer comes down to two things that sound like they belong in completely different stories: a whale and a tax on oil. Hold on to both of those, because by the end you'll see how the people who look the most cut off from America quietly built one of its wealthiest, best organized corners of it. Let me show you what cut off actually means up here first, because it's easy to say and hard to picture. There is no drive to Utqiagvik. You cannot load a truck in Anchorage and point it north and arrive. The town is not connected to Alaska's road system at all. If you want to come here, you fly. Almost everything the town eats, wears, and builds with either flies in on air cargo all year round, or it comes once a summer on a barge. That barge is called the sea lift. When the sea ice finally breaks up and pulls back from the coast for a few short weeks, a barge makes the run and drops off the heavy things: trucks, building materials, fuel, the big supplies that would cost a fortune to fly. One shot. If it isn't on the barge, it flies, and flying things to the top of the world is not cheap. That is why the grocery store is the way it is. A few years back, people started documenting the prices at the store here, and the numbers went around the internet because they look made up. A gallon of milk around $10, a bottle of orange juice closer to $17, a single avocado about $5, half a watermelon flown in priced near $37. Now those exact figures are a few years old, so treat them as a snapshot, not today's receipt. But the shape of it holds. When your food has to fly to the roof of the continent is where the price tag ends up. And it isn't only food. Think about everything a town needs that you never really think about. A new truck, lumber for a house, a washing machine, a snowmobile part in the middle of winter. Down south, every one of those things is a drive to a store and a decision you make in an afternoon. Up here, every single one of them is either a plane ticket's worth of freight or a wait for next summer's barge. A town like this has to plan the way a ship at sea plans, thinking months ahead about what it will need and when the one narrow window to bring in the heavy things will actually open. That is a completely different way of living. And the people here are extraordinarily good at it, because the place gives them no choice but to be. And if that were the whole story, you'd expect a town of people barely hanging on, eating out of that store, going broke one grocery run at a time. But that store is not really how this town eats, not at its core. Here's the part people from outside almost always miss. The real food base up here does not come from a shelf. It comes from the ocean. The Iñupiat here are whaling people, and they have been for thousands of years. The center of it is the bowhead whale, a huge, dark Arctic whale that migrates past this coast twice a year. Crews go out after it in spring and in fall, and a single successful hunt can bring in an enormous amount of food. That meat and blubber does not get sold, it gets shared. A whaling captain who lands a whale distributes it through the community by long-standing custom, and that sharing reaches across the whole town. Add in seal, caribou, walrus, and fish, and you have a food economy that has fed this place since long before there was a store to overcharge anybody. So already the paradox is cracking open. This looks like the most desperate spot in the country. It is nothing of the kind. It is a place where people chose to stay, built to last, and eat from an ocean their ancestors have read like a map for 100 generations. If that flip is the kind of thing you find yourself leaning into, the gap between what a place looks like and what it actually is, that's the whole reason this channel exists. We go to the corners of America you almost can't reach, the ones that look impossible from the outside, and we show you how people actually live there. If that's your thing, subscribe and come along, because the deepest part of this one, the whale and the oil tax, is still ahead. Now let's talk about how you stay warm at the top of the world. Because darkness and cold are the other half of the impossibility here, and heat is not optional. When the sun disappears in November and stays gone for about 2 months, and the wind is coming straight off a frozen ocean, a house that loses its heat is not uncomfortable. It's deadly. So you would assume this town, like a lot of remote Arctic villages, burns expensive diesel that has to be shipped in and stored. That is the normal story up here. It is not this town's story. Utqiagvik heats itself with its own natural gas. Right nearby, within about 13 miles of town, there are natural gas fields in the ground. Gas started reaching the town through pipes back in 1965, and in the 1980s, the local Iñupiat government secured the rights to the gas under the ground. Today, that gas feeds a member-owned local utility that turns it into electricity and pipes heat straight into homes. Think about what that means. The northernmost town in America is not at the mercy of a fuel barge for the one thing it cannot live without. It is sitting on its own heat supply, and it owns it. But owning the grid is only half the problem the Arctic hands you. The other half is the ground itself. Utqiagvik is built on permafrost, soil that stays frozen year-round. You cannot just bury a water pipe in it the way you would down south, because a buried pipe up here would freeze solid, or worse, its own warmth would thaw the frozen ground, and the whole thing would sink and buckle. So the town solved it above the ground. There is a system here called the utilidor, short for utility corridor, an insulated network that carries fresh water and sewage through the community while keeping it from freezing in a place where freezing's the default state of everything. It is the kind of quiet engineering that never makes a postcard, and it is the reason a modern town can function on frozen ground at all. And notice who owns it. The utility that turns that gas into heat and power up here is member-owned, which means it belongs, in effect, to the community it serves, not to a corporation a few thousand miles away. The gas rights sit with the local Iñupiat government. So the money you pay to stay warm in January does not leave town. It circles back into the same place it came from. In most of rural America, the power company is somebody else, somewhere else, and your bill is money walking out the door. Here, more or less, the power company is you and your neighbors. That one fact quietly changes the whole math of living somewhere this hard. Picture it for a second. It is January. It has been dark for weeks. Outside, the wind chill is far below anything you have ever stood in. And inside these homes, it is warm, the water runs, the lights are on, and the fuel doing it came out of the ground a few miles away. That is not survival by luck. That is a town that engineered its own comfort at the top of the planet, and it swings the other way just as hard. Come summer, the sun does the exact opposite. It climbs up and simply refuses to set, circling the sky around the clock for weeks on end. So the same town buried in blackness in January is soaked in non-stop daylight in June. That is the window when the barge comes in. It's the light the whaling crews and the builders work by. A body has to learn to sleep when the sun never goes down and to keep moving when it never comes up. People who grow up here carry that rhythm in their bones. To a visitor, it is disorienting. To the people who live here, it is just the year, turning the way it always has. Now, what about the thing that scares people most about being remote? Not the cold, not the dark. Getting hurt. What happens when someone up here has a heart attack, or a bad fall, or a difficult birth, with the nearest big city an ocean of tundra away? Utqiagvik has a hospital, not a clinic, a hospital, and it is the northernmost one in the entire United States. It's called the Samuel Simmons Memorial Hospital, and it's run by the Arctic Slope Native Association, a regional Iñupiat health organization. Day to day, that hospital handles what a hospital handles. But there is a hard limit to what any facility this far out can do, and everyone here knows where that line is. When a case is beyond what the hospital can treat, the patient gets flown out. Medevac aircraft carry serious cases hundreds of miles south to Anchorage, to the bigger medical center there. That flight is the lifeline, and it exists, funded and ready, in one of the most isolated places a person can be born in this country. And there is a quieter point buried in that. A hospital this far north, run by a regional Iñupiat health organization, is not something a struggling town scrapes together out of nothing. It is something a community with real resources decides to build, staff, and keep going on purpose, so that people can be born and treated and cared for at home, instead of being forced to leave the Arctic entirely just to get medicine. It costs serious money to run a hospital at the top of the world. The fact that this one is here and staffed and backed by a flight out when the worst happens is one more sign pointing at the same conclusion. The money is here, so where's it coming from? So stack it up. Food that comes from the sea and gets shared across town, heat and power from the community's own gas, water moving through frozen ground in an engineered corridor, a hospital at the top of the world with a flight out when things get bad. None of that is how a desperate place behaves. Every piece of it costs money and coordination, and somebody is paying for it, and paying well, which brings us to the real engine, the thing that makes all of it possible, and it is not the whale, not yet. It is the tax. To understand it, you have to go back to 1972, and to a decision that turned out to be one of the smartest moves a small group of people ever made in the state of Alaska. Around that time, enormous oil wealth was coming out of the ground on the North Slope, this vast stretch of Arctic Alaska at Prudhoe Bay and the fields around it. Oil companies were building an immense amount of infrastructure out there. Pipelines, processing plants, drilling operations, roads, all of it worth staggering sums of money. And most of it sat on land the Iñupiat had lived on forever. So the Iñupiat did something that changed everything. They formed their own regional government, the North Slope Borough, covering a piece of Arctic Alaska larger than a lot of American states, around 89,000 square miles. And that borough got the power to do what governments do, tax property. Now think about what property means out here. The single most valuable property on the entire North Slope is not houses. It is the oil infrastructure, billions of dollars of it. And the North Slope Borough, run by the same Iñupiat community that lives in Utqiagvik, taxes it. The result is a local government funded overwhelmingly by oil and gas property taxes. The great majority of the borough's money comes from taxing that industrial infrastructure out on the tundra. We are talking about a scale that dwarfs what a town of 5,000 could ever raise on its own, on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars a year flowing into a borough with a very small population. I want to be careful here, because the exact figure moves year to year and lives in the Borough's budget documents, so treat it as a large estimate rather than an audited number. But the direction is not in doubt. This is a small Arctic community that turned the oil under and around its homeland into a public treasury. And here is what they did with it. They built the schools, they funded the hospital, they backed the utilities that pipe the gas and run the water. They pay for search and rescue and public safety across an enormous, dangerous stretch of Arctic that no distant government was ever going to cover. The reason Utqiagvik does not look or function like a desperate outpost is that its own government, built by its own people, taxes some of the richest industrial property in North America and spends it at home. That is the machine. That is the answer to how $10 milk and 2 months of darkness add up to one of the best run small towns in the country instead of the poorest. And it is worth sitting with how unusual that really is. All across the American Arctic, in the rural West, you find tiny communities waiting on a state capital or a federal agency, far away and slow, to fund the basics, and often waiting for years. Utqiagvik does not wait. The borough is the government up here. It is the biggest employer, the body that keeps the lights on, the school open, and the rescue plane fueled, and it answers to the people who live under it. When the folks who run a place and the folks who live in a place are the same folks, decisions get made for the people actually standing in the wind, not for someone's budget line 1,000 miles south. That is rarer than it ought to be in this country, and it is a huge part of why any of this holds together. Now hold that thought, because money explains how they can afford to be here. It does not explain why they are here at all. Nobody stays on the edge of a frozen ocean for a good tax base. To understand why this town exists, why people love it, why they fight to keep it, you have to go back to the whale. And this is the part I most want you to stay for. So if you're finding this worth your time, subscribe so it comes back around to you, because this next part is the heart of the whole place. Let's go to the ice. The bowhead hunt here is not a hobby, and it is not a leftover. It is the center of Iñupiat life, and it has been for something like 2,000 years or more. Whaling crews are organized under a captain, and being a whaling captain here is one of the most respected roles a person can hold. In the spring, crews haul small skin boats out across the sea ice to the edge of the open water called the lead, and they wait, sometimes for a long time in brutal conditions, for the bowhead to pass. It takes a whole community to do it, to scout the ice, to cut the trail, to crew the boats, to help land and butcher a whale that can weigh many tons, and then to share it out. When a whale is landed, the entire town knows, and the meat is divided and given out through the captain by rules of sharing that go back countless generations. And that sharing is not just a way to feed people, it is the social glue of the whole place. Later in the year, the successful crews hold a community celebration and give the whale away hand to hand to everyone. If you have ever wondered what actually holds a town together at the edge of the world, a lot of the answer is right there. Not a paycheck. A whale taken by your neighbors out on the ice and handed to you in person, the same way it has been handed down for far longer than almost any tradition still alive in America today. And because the bowhead is a protected species, this is not unlimited. It runs under a formal subsistence arrangement. Through the International Whaling Commission, the Alaska Iñupiat communities are granted a strict subsistence quota, a set number of whales they may strike over a period of years, managed among about 11 villages by the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. Utqiagvik, as the largest of the whaling communities, takes the biggest single share of that quota. It is a carefully limited, closely tracked, sustainable hunt, run in large part by the very people who depend on it, on a whale population they have every reason on earth to protect. This is not the ocean being emptied. This is a community keeping a 2,000-year-old relationship alive under real rules. And this is exactly where the name comes in, the thing I told you to hold at the start. For most of the last century, on maps and in the news, this town was called Barrow, a name that came from an English official who never set foot here. But the Iñupiat name for this place is older, and it is theirs, Utqiagvik. In 2016, the people here voted to make it official, and on the first day of December that year, Barrow formally became Utqiagvik again. It was a close vote, and people felt strongly on both sides, because a name carries a lot, but the meaning of it is hard to miss. The town put its own language back on the map, the language of the people who have hunted this coast since long before the country around it had a name. When you understand the whale, you understand why that mattered so much. So now you can see the two halves fit together. The oil tax is how they can afford this life at the top of the world. The whale is why they want it. One is a modern government built in the 1970s. The other is a hunt older than most of recorded history. And they are held by the same people in the same town at the same time. That is the thing the outside world keeps getting wrong about this place. It is not a story of people barely surviving somewhere they got trapped. It is a story of people who took one of the harshest coasts on the planet and built a life on it that works on their own terms. Which is exactly why the last part of this is the hardest. Because the one thing this community engineered its way around for decades, it cannot tax or pipe or fly its way out of. The coast itself is moving. Utqiagvik sits right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and that edge is eroding. For most of history, thick sea ice sat against this coast for much of the year and acted like a shield, taking the force of the storms before they ever reached the land. But the sea ice is forming later and thinning out, and the frozen ground the town is built on, the permafrost, is thawing at the edges. When a storm now rolls in across open water that used to be ice, it hits the shore directly, and it takes the softening ground with it. The land the town stands on is quietly being eaten from the seaside. On top of that, the natural gas fields that heat everything are not new, and no gas field lasts forever, though exactly how much runway remains is not something I'm going to claim to know. So this community, which has already outlasted every outside assumption about it, is facing the next test in real time. Not from the price of milk, not from the dark, from the ocean it has lived beside for thousands of years, changing faster than it ever has. And if you had to bet on anyone reading that coast and adapting to it, you would bet on the people who have been reading it longest. Because step all the way back and look at what is actually up here. A town with no road, buried in darkness for 2 months a year, milk at $10 a gallon, sitting on frozen ground at the literal top of America. By every lazy assumption, the poorest, most desperate place in the country. And instead, the people who looked the most cut off from America turned around and quietly built one of the richest, best run corners of it, warmed by their own gas, doctored by their own hospital, governed by their own borough, funded by a tax on the oil under their homeland, and held together through all of it by a whale their ancestors have hunted for 2,000 years. Not a place America saved, a place that built itself at the one address, almost nobody thought anyone could.